So I want to talk about tech interviewing today and why it's broken. But it's not broken because of whiteboarding or big O notation or algorithms. It's broken because of you and me and our bias. And I first became aware of this several years ago when I read an essay in a book of essays by Malcolm Gladwell called What the Dog Saw. And the particular essay I wanted to talk about today is called The New Boy Network. And this essay is fascinating. It was written in March 2000. And even though it's over 20 years old, I think it's still as relevant today as it ever has been. And as a person who does a lot of interviewing, I have a lot of thoughts about it. And I think it really nails something that is wrong with how we do modern interviewing in general. So I wanted to talk about that today. So this article starts out talking about a guy named Nolan Myers, who Malcolm Gladwell found to go interview. He interviews him at the ABP at Harvard Square, which coincidentally is where one of my favorite scenes in movie history takes place.
All right. It's me. Okay. All right.
And anyway, they meet, and Gladwell's kind of writing and talking about how he thinks this guy's great, but he starts to reflect on why he thinks this guy is great and what evidence he really has for this guy being great. And he basically doesn't have anything substantive. He realizes that he's kind of formed a first impression on the basis of nothing, and that this guy just happens to appear likable and kind of speak easily. And so because of that, Gladwell is drawn to this guy, but there is a problem with that. And so Gladwell starts to talk about how there are two other people in the story that also really like Nolan Myers. He, by the way, looks like this. I'm a stalker and I found him on LinkedIn, so I thought maybe that would help to see what he looks like today. Now he's a CEO, but in college, apparently he had brown hair according to Gladwell. I'm sure he looked a little bit different, but thought the visual would be nice. Anyway, there were two other executives that really liked Nolan Myers, wanted him to join their companies. One is this guy named Hattie Partovi, who was at this startup called Tell Me, and the other guy was Steve Ballmer. And we know Steve Ballmer loves developers, right?
First developers, 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 developers.
So anyway, both of them had met him really briefly. Hattie Partovi had met him in an interviewing day, and Steve Ballmer, he'd asked Steve Ballmer a question at a conference type thing where Steve Ballmer was giving a talk, and on the basis of those brief interactions, they formed an impression. They decided they really liked this guy. So that is kind of the setup. So we start talking about Nolan Myers, then Gladwell gets into the research. So there's some really, really interesting research that has been done about how we judge people and how we form first impressions. Okay, so we're going to talk about the research. So if you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell, you know he cites a lot of research and ends up kind of weaving all of these various threads together. So the first study that he talks about was done at Harvard, and basically what they did is they had students watch a 2-second video clip and rate how they thought a teacher would do on all these different kind of checklist items, like would they do well explaining things, would they be accessible, would they be knowledgeable, all those kind of things. And then they compared that with the same teachers with students who were filling out semester evaluations. So one group has seen a 2-second clip of this person teaching, the other has sat in a class with them for an entire semester. And so what ended up happening was basically there was no difference, or there was an extremely high degree of correlation. So what that tells us is that we form an impression in 2 seconds after just seeing a video of somebody that doesn't change after knowing them for 4 months. And we're drawing conclusions about how good that person is at their job based on those 2 seconds. So to me, that's pretty mind-blowing. That shows me that there is something at play here, right? And so there's kind of another study which was done at the University of Toledo, I believe. And so they wanted to take it one step further, and they wanted to kind of test this idea that the handshake is everything. So what they did is they took two groups, yet again. They took one group of people who are trained, skilled interviewers, and then they took another group of people who are just observing literally a person coming in and shaking hands with everybody. And so what they found in this case was that, again, the assessments were not very different. So the people who just see the handshake of someone coming into a room for an interview, their assessment is not very different from people who go through a whole interview with that person and are trained in the art of interviewing. So that is pretty crazy. It again shows us that we're kind of making these snap judgments. And so what they're saying here is that the strength of the correlations between the people actually interviewing and the people just observing videotapes of the interview is extremely highly correlated to like a shocking degree. And so at the end of this section, Gladwell has a quote, and the quote is, "This is why Adi Partovi, Steve Ballmer, and I all agreed on Nolan Myers. Apparently human beings don't need to know someone in order to believe that they know someone, nor does it make that much difference, apparently, that Partovi reached his conclusion after putting Myers through the ringer for an hour. I reached mine after 90 minutes of amiable conversation et à bon pain, and Ballmer reached his after watching and listening as Myers asked a question." So, as I was saying, there's three pretty wildly varying time differences there and exposure to this person, but they all reach the same conclusion. So as an additional part of his research, Gladwell sits down with an interviewing specialist. And this is somebody who has been trained in what's called structured interviews. And structured interviews are basically designed to kind of take bias out. And so you ask the same set of questions to every single person and you score their answers according to a rubric. And so the idea behind it is designed to extract information and not kind of hopefully subject to as much kind of our bias and how much we like a person, stuff like that. So what Gladwell says is that it is very different than a normal interview. For example, when he was with Nolan Myers, he was trying to get a kind of global sense of who this person was, but he says that the structured interview is as concerned with rejecting information as collecting it. It is very focused and very narrow. He also says it's not really about getting to know somebody in the traditional sense, which is pretty different from how normal job interviews go. Normal job interviews, he says, are kind of like a desexualized date, and I would tend to agree. We're trying to like see if we have chemistry and all that kind of stuff, and one of Gladwell's main points is that is super subject to bias. And that brings us to the conclusion. So where does this idea, the New Boy Network, come from? So I'll read another quote. So on the note of what I was just talking about, Gladwell says, "For most of us, hiring someone is essentially a romantic process. We're looking for someone with whom we have a certain chemistry. Even if the coupling that results ends in tears, and the pursuer and the pursued turn out to have nothing in common. We want the unlimited promise of a love affair. The structured interview, by contrast, seems to offer only the dry logic and practicality of an arranged marriage." So that's one quote, really interesting, kind of ties into what I was saying, is that we want this kind of thrilling, romantic, almost dating-like process. We aren't concerned with drawing information, we're concerned with the chemistry. And that is a problem, he's saying. And he kind of ties it together with another really good quote, which kind of really sums up, I think, kind of the differences between the ways things used to be done, which he calls the old boy network, and the way that things are done now in the new economy, which he calls the new boy network. And we're still seeing that today. So I mentioned this is over 20 years old, but this kind of interviewing and this kind of work culture is still prevalent today. So he says, if this were 1965, Nolan Myers would have gone to work at IBM and worn a blue suit and sat in a small office and kept his head down, and the particulars of his personality would not have mattered so much. And then he starts talking about how that is not the case today, and now we're supposed to be working in flexible cross-functional teams and playing ping pong with each other and chatting around the coffee and the water cooler. And so he says in closing that in that environment where the workplace doubles as the rec room, the particulars of your personality matter a great deal. But the danger here is that we will be led astray in judging these newly important particulars of character. If we let personality bias the hiring process today, then all we will have done is replace the old boy network, where you hired your nephew, with the new boy network, where you hire whomever impressed you most when you shook his hand. Social progress, unless we're careful, can merely be the means by which we replace the obviously arbitrary with the not so obviously arbitrary. And so that's really the point. The point is that we think that we're doing a good thing in allowing people to interview based on their aptitudes and trying to get the job to quote unquote the best person, but that the way that things are set up, we are set up to fail. We are set up to be blinded by our own biases. And so that is really the point. That is why interviewing is broken. As I mentioned at the beginning, this isn't just tech interviews, this is all interviews, but I think it applies really particularly to the tech industry. So Tech interviews aren't broken because of whiteboarding or AIs that scan through resumes and automatically reject you. And it's not broken because of the big O notation. It's not broken because of the way that the interviews are done traditionally. It's broken because of us and our own biases. And this article really draws that out. I think about it all the time. As someone who does a lot of interviewing, it's always on my mind. So I'd recommend it. If it sounds interesting to you, you can just Google the New Boy Network and it will come up. Thanks for sticking with me through this. Again, a different kind of interview. I'm starting to talk a little bit more about ideas that I really love and things that I think about a lot, and not just technology, but I think this is super relevant for technology. So thanks for sticking with me. If you liked this video, then consider subscribing. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.